So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to have, I guess, what we used to call a table discussion, but we're not sitting around round tables anymore. So, I'll just call it a conversation rather than a more traditional talk, which, yeah, I throw out some ideas and people responding and coming up with their own insights is, of course, always welcome at Wayfarers. But this one's designed more around questions and full conversation, not me coming up with my ideas and having people respond. For folks who aren't able to be there, obviously, missing out on the discussion is a shame. But in this video and kind of in the ones in the future, on the weeks we're doing these conversations, I figured I would at least kind of read the quotes I'm having us look at and think about, give a few of my own thoughts. So in some ways, you can still be at least a part of the discussion. So this week we are going to be looking at together some verses out of 1 Corinthians 5, 16 through 21, and a few quotes that I picked out because I had picked out on this passage thoughts on reconciliation, both reconciliation between God and reconciliation among other people, how those are related. So first, let me read this, the quote from Corinthians. So then, from this point on, we won't recognize people by human standards. Even though we used to know Christ by human standards, this isn't how we know him now. So then, if anyone is in Christ, that person is part of a new creation. The old things have gone away, and look, new things have arrived. All of these things are from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and who gave us the ministry of reconciliation. In other words, God was reconciling the world to himself through Christ, not by counting people's sins against them. He has trusted us with this message of reconciliation. So we are ambassadors who represent Christ. God is negotiating with you through us. We beg you as Christ's representatives, be reconciled to God. God caused the one who didn't know sin to be sin for our sake, so that through him we could become the righteousness of God. So this passage is, of course, reminding us of just the biblical truth that the base problem in the world is not necessarily a metaphysical one, that it's a lack of relationship between us and God. This broken relationship has consequences for the rest of humanity. And so, of course, in the cross, God decisively took the brokenness, the death of the world, the sin of the world into himself to reconcile God the Father with the rest of humanity. And I'm not the first person who's seen a recognition here between reconciling with God and reconciling with a lot of the brokenness and the just kind of shattered nature of the relationships among the members of humanity as well. And so a quote from another book that's picking up on this idea that I shared with everyone. This is a quote from a book called Mending the Divides by Hutkins and Swigart. On page 40 it says this: "The restoration of all things was in God's view from the very beginning. God is the great peacemaker who established the priority of peace and the practice of peacemaking throughout history. God in Jesus embodied the peacemaking practices of seeing, immersing, and contending in order to restore shalom. In the life and death of Jesus, God waged the decisive peace promised to Abraham. The resurrection confirmed that all things were reconciled to God. Peacemaking is the mission of God and the vocation of God's people. While it's hard work, peacemaking is neither a strategy to employ nor an obligation to uphold. It is a life fueled by our identity as reconciled beloved of God." And so the point I think that they're making there is similar to the one I was trying to say earlier, that because we love God, because we've been reconciled to God, therefore we have to step into reconciliation with other people in the world. And so, yeah, I think they point out that reconciliation is tough work, especially nowadays. Nowadays, we have a very divided, very tribal society. People are very used to just hanging out with folks that think like they do and value the same things that they do. And those who don't fall into their tribe, however they choose to define it, are outsiders, are those we need to stay away from. From the religious perspective, you get a lot of language around like purity, and they can taint us, they can tear us down in some way, shape, or form. And despite the fact that I think that this attitude is incredibly prevalent in our culture and in our churches, our spiritual communities, it doesn't square with God's desire, and with the way God spent his time when he was here on earth. He was incredible at stepping over the boundaries he wasn't supposed to, of not allowing a group of people to say, here's who's in, who's out. He recognized that not everyone would want to be part of this kind of new humanity he was working at creating, but everyone was welcome. And so this idea of reconciliation is one we get from being reconciled to God. It gets one that is modeled to us as followers of Jesus. And so the last quote I wanted us to think about and look at comes from one that talks about just kind of the abundant life and God's desire for the abundant life, but I think it has a lot to do with reconciliation as well. This quote comes from For the Life of the World by Wolf and Crossaman, and this comes from page 80. The love of the triune God on the journey of redemption through history is a love that often has to suffer. As it is in God's life and Christ's life, so, analogously, in the lives of those called and empowered by the Spirit to be Christ's to the world and to participate in Christ's mission, except that they too are part of the world that has not yet fully become God's home. A tension marks the life they live in this world, a struggle, internal and private as well as social, even structural and public, for the true life in the midst of a false one. God came to call people to a flourishing life. Guided by God's kind of love, and empowered by God's Spirit, all of us are called to flourish fully in the world become God's home, and partially on the journey there, rejoicing even while having to mourn, willingly accepting lack, so that the needs of others can be satisfied, leading lives of courage and integrity as we struggle against the evils of this age, trusting and loving God, participating in God's mission in the world, and in all of this, growing into our human fullness. And so that quote for me is one that points out, again, the big picture, what God is trying to do behind all these things he asks of us that often can feel counterintuitive or difficult. God is not doing this because there is some kind of spiritual or religious value to doing things that are hard and we don't feel like. Effort does not make spirituality. He's inviting us into an abundant life, a better life of flourishing, in which his presence, his ways of being are in the world. You've probably picked up on this theme if you've listened to my teaching in any way, shape, or form. This is one that I think we miss a lot of the time and is so important. But I think it's one that's really important for reconciliation, particularly because in a deeply divided culture where it's so much easier to just hang out with folks who are like us, I think we have a Christian and a spiritual obligation to be around people who disagree with us, who have a very different vision of what the flourishing life is than we do. I think we need to humbly recognize that there are going to be errors, that there are going to things in that vision we've received not from God directly, but from the places we grew up, from the families we came from, and that's okay. But we need to be willing to hold those things a little more loosely. We need to be willing to have people challenge us on really what is most important and help us see our blind spots just as we come to the table recognizing there are things we bring. And I think reconciliation is one of those. Whereas people without a spiritual obligation, because they don't understand how loved they are by God, they haven't experienced this reconciliation with God yet, it makes sense to stay away from people who are making you uncomfortable or who might be downright threatening. But for those of us who have been reconciled to God, we have to both talk about and express and show what this relationship with God and the world and this flourishing can look like. And that means being willing to be uncomfortable, being willing to even be threatened at times to bring this flourishing life, this other way of being to people, because I think the just kind of the tribalism, the just shatteredness, the fact that people can't even talk to one another. There aren't meaningful places to talk to one another about the things that are often so important to them because they can't agree on something. And so reconciliation is really, really hard work. It's very counterintuitive work, but it's work that I think we can be empowered and guided in because it's work that God values so highly, and it's work that He's doing constantly Himself. So, those are just a few of my thoughts on peacemaking and those quotes I read.